Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And I'm delighted that my guest is once again Patricia Walsh. Hello, Patricia.
Hello, Anna.
So the last time that we met, which was maybe a bit more than a year ago, we were talking about evolutionary astrology.
Yes.
And you are now going to be speaking at the Astrological Association's conference, which is more than one day, folks. It's the 23rd to the 25th of September, which is plenty of astrology to keep everybody happy. So if you haven't rushed to get your tickets, I will be putting a link on the description box so that you can do that. And Patricia is one of the many wonderful people who will be there. The talk that you're giving is Pluto in Aquarius, A Brave New World. I think we have to be a bit brave at the moment.
I think so.
But I thought it might be good today to talk about Pluto and in general, but I thought specifically in terms of the evolution of societies.
Well, Pluto is a great marker for that. I mean, as you know, collectives evolve slower than individuals, right? And Pluto being one of the slowest moving planets that we count, and also, that theoretically it represents some of the psychology of the soul and the force of evolution upon the soul. So Pluto is a great marker of generations, right? So we often say, oh, there's a, Pluto Virgo generation, a Pluto Leo generation, et cetera. And so that marks a kind of bottom line psychology for a, group of people. And as you know, Pluto moves from 15 to 30 degrees in a sign. We're in one of it where it's starting to slow down now, right? It has an elliptical cycle. So Pluto will run, an area when it gets over to, I'm doing the circle as if this was the zodiacal wheel. When Pluto gets over to Libra, Scorpio, and Sag, it moves faster. Stays at shortest time in Scorpio, which I always find interesting since it's the sign it rules in modern astrology. I often say we wouldn't survive if it stayed in Scorpio any longer, right?
Indeed. I've kind of been wishing that it would pick up some speed in Capricorn, but alas.
Oh, yeah, it's really slow. It feels, well, but, Capricorn is that kind of sign. And we've been in, you really, what I love, I'm sure as many people do in astrology and just in the field of synchronicity is, we always say, you can't make this stuff up, right? I mean, almost the second that Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008, the world economy crashed, right? It was like the night before, everything was fine. All the economists were like, oh, the housing market's great, everything was great. And then one morning, Ben Bernanke woke up with his hair on fire, right? Running around the White House lawn. And it's like none of them knew how to do math. And we were in the housing crisis. We were in the subprime mortgage crisis, which then, of course, had a ripple effect. And so, Capricorn is that kind of sign. It's a sign of consolidation. It's a sign of winter. It's a sign of pruning, of conserving. So we've seen all of these permutations of manifestations of how Pluto's been acting in Capricorn, contraction of economies, consolidation of power, right? We've also seen the rise, and many astrologers said this even before Pluto went into Capricorn, that we would see a rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, et cetera. And we're seeing, we have seen it. And yes, it's getting old, right? Now, Aquarius is also a winter sign, but it has that electric air, right? And it's something's, it has electric air, which can also be restlessness, right? And we saw that with the Pluto-Uranus squares. right? That was also another one of those, you can't make this stuff up, because as those Pluto-Uranus squares started coming into effect, you know, we had the Arab Spring, and then that swept across the globe as far as uprisings. You know, my perception is that those Pluto-Uranus squares are still unsatiated. You know, they never, it's like, yes, they caused massive uprisings, but what was the change, right? Because we still have that old patriarchal death grip, which is again Capricorn, right? You know, we still have the old order kind of in its death rattle, you know, holding on to power.
Unfinished business, I would say.
Yeah.
And certainly the buzzword, I think, of the Pluto Capricorn era there's been two. Compliance and austerity. And I think that if I hear those two words one more time, I might myself just combust, because I'm in no mood to comply with anything. And I am absolutely done with austerity. It seems that in its death throes, austerity is becoming more intense, and we're meant to, hey folks, you're meant to like it. I don't think so. So, you know, there it is. And that's the seeds, isn't it? The seeds of rebellion and revolution, as we know from the last time Pluto was in Capricorn.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then popped into Aquarius, and then we had all kinds of revolutions, right? That actually made change. We'll see with this one, you know. Like I said, I really believe that even in this Pluto Capricorn time, the unmanifest sweeping changes that the Pluto-Uranus squares were calling for collectively are still unfulfilled. And so that discontent, and I gave a lecture on the Pluto and Capricorn, and I called it the winter of our discontent, right? So while there's been all of this clamping down and, you know, again, like you said, austerity is a perfect Capricorn word, right? Conservatism, rise of conservatism and austerity. While there's been all of that, this anger under the surface is a kind of, you know, manifestation also of this Pluto and Capricorn time. Which I believe, you know, I think that you know, I'm not going to go ahead into stuff that I'm talking about, but, you know, I do believe that there is going to be a bit of a breath of fresh air with the Pluto into Aquarius, right? And I think we need to hold on to our hats, because I think exponential change is much more possible in Pluto and Aquarius than it is in Capricorn.
Well, I think the difference for me between Capricorn and Aquarius is that you can smell spring in the air. It's okay, it's not by any stretch of the imagination time for spring yet. And, you know, I grew up in Canada where, trust me, Aquarius time, it's still the depths of winter and rain for spring. But there is something of that. And I think it's the fact that even in its association with the 11th house, it's dawn, isn't it? It's just after dawn. It's like that morning, perhaps mid-morning, and you kind of feel a little bit more awake, and, you know, the sun is coming up to its peak, and it's just got that hopefulness to it that is missing when Capricorn really gets into its stride.
Sure. Well, and what we have today that we didn't have the last time Pluto was in Capricorn was technology, which we know Aquarius rules. I'm sorry, when it was last in Aquarius, which we know Aquarius Uranus rules. So, you know, that's where I feel the Renaissance, right? There's an exponential Renaissance potentially there, and everything has its shadow, right? So I'm going to talk about that in my lecture, the potential manifestations of the positives and the negatives, right? Because again, you wanted to talk about the collective and Jung talked about this also. Collective often plays out, unfortunately, unlike the individual, where the individual has more free will, right? But when you put a group of psyches together, and you end up kind of boiling down to the lowest common denominator, and then evolution moves slower on the collective level. So, that often means that sometimes we manifest the worst of those, like we did with Pluto and Sag. Pluto and Sag was all of this optimism, and that was what led to the housing crisis, the subprime mortgage thing, economically. And we also had the rise of religious, because we know Sag is about religious beliefs and so on. We also had the rise of religious extremism, right?
Indeed. And I think maybe what we're saying is that Pluto takes us to the extremes, which we know to be true. And it's the extremes, both ends.
Well, to me, I always say that the Scorpio glyph itself is the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. And the revisitation of the highest of the high to the lowest of the low to the final resurrection, which is the upward pointing tail at the end. And that is how Pluto operates, right? It encompasses the highest, it's an intensely healing power, right? Pluto, and we know it's an intensely healing power because it digs down to the roots. It doesn't just, put a mantra over it and an affirmation, right? It goes and does the catharsis, right? It does the caphonic work, right? The underground work in the subconscious, and rips things up from the roots so that real transformation can happen.
And that's the point, because I was going to say to you, so what's the point of all of this, Patricia? Why are we constantly going through this process? And I guess that brings us to evolution, doesn't it?
Well, I would say, I don't have even though I am a Sag, I don't have the ultimate answer to anything. Theoretically, yes, I mean, it is observable. It is, it is objectively observable that there is a force of evolution, right? It's objectively observable that there is a force of evolution on the human psyche as well as not just biology. So, if we give that assignment to Pluto, then Pluto is acting on that level, right? On the to the reductionists, we could say it acts on the DNA, and to those interested more in soul and psyche, then it's acting on the human psyche.
Do you feel, and you have a very interesting take on history, because I don't mean take as in perspective, I mean an opportunity to understand history. Reason being that it's not just about what you read about history or what you study about history. You have a ringside seat, if you like, into history through the past life regressions that you have witnessed. And I know, reading your book, that it's like the history of humanity, looking at all the case studies. And I feel the same when I'm doing past life regressions, that it's like I've stepped into a time capsule and I'm witnessing something of the history of humanity and that particular life. Because the truth of the matter is that each individual soul has been a part of history. And it's, we can be watching films on TV, historical films and historical novels, and we can read historical novels and we can think, oh yeah, that's in the past. But we are the physical DNA that's come from the past, and we have a soul history, a soul lineage that also comes from that history. So we are this embodiment of history, and you have this very interesting perspective looking at it. So the question is, given this interesting perspective, do you feel that anything has actually changed? Do you feel that we as human beings really are evolving, or are we stuck on this never-ending wheel?
Or are we devolving?
Or
devolving, yeah.
There, ask that, because that's far too hopeless. Because occasionally I think, it feels like we're going backwards now.
Yeah. Well, wow, that's a multi-layered question. Yes, I have learned a lot about history through regression. And because the style of regression that I do, is real, it's not about, names and dates and places and so on. It's not that surface level. It's really about digging into the psyche of the past life self, what was imprinted, what was wounded, what was carried forward, etc. So you get this really deep, I've gotten this really deep picture into the evolving psyche over time. And I would say, I was thinking as you were asking that question, I have noticed in my work that in other civilizations, let's say even going back to indigenous lives, right? People that have had experiences there, trauma is imprinted differently then, right? And that has a lot to do with the structure of the society, right? And the interconnectedness of that. And the way that we imprint trauma as it moves forward into the rise of Western civilization, I'm going to use that in air quotes, right? Civilization, which isn't so civilized. As we progress there, the way that the human psyche imprints trauma and carries it forward is definitely different. And that is, and I would say that's not a great picture, right, of the way that, because just look at the way we process it in society. We don't, right? I mean, even it was only World War II where they started to call PTSD for veterans shell shock. So it was only, and then even then there was a lot of denial around it, right? And look at what happened to the Vietnam vets in the US when they came home. They were shamed and humiliated and had to carry not only the wounds of that war, but carry the shame of society projected onto them. And so, yeah, we don't process it well. And in fact, I have a friend who's a veteran that I was talking to this weekend, and I was saying how, in ancient civilizations, they had different rituals to bring warriors back to society. And in one Zulu tradition, it was called the washing of the spears. And it's not like you came home from war and just went back to your village. There was a progressive, they'd enter a certain amount of huts and do these rituals of washing the spears of blood, symbolically, ritually, which is cleansing the soul, so that they could enter back into civilization. And so those kinds of ritual enactments, the awareness of the level of those earlier societies, right, to me has shown that we are in a more condensed period. And then we'd have to take up the conversation of the yugas, right? And where are we in that Vedantic philosophy of where are we on that yuga cycle? And that, the one that I would follow would say that we're coming out of the Kali Yuga into the Treta Yuga, which then means we're starting an upswing, but we have been through a dark period, which is a kind of dimming of collective human consciousness.
I think listening to you, there was a thought that crossed my mind, and that is that, and you'll know this being a healer of sorts, and me being a healer of sorts, is that healing is not linear. And I don't believe evolution necessarily is linear.
No, I always say it's a spiral. Well, it's not even a belief. Again, the insight that you said that we have from regression is going to show that, and it does show in the human psyche, especially when I work with somebody like in my training program over a course of 2 years, and we end up working with several dozen, if not more, past lives. You can really see the individual evolution of a soul. So there's 2 points to that question. Yes, to me, it's a spiral, because that is the way the human psyche imprints trauma. There's a repetition compulsion factor within it, right? We get wounded, and then the psyche continues to get stuck in that spot and continue to repeat that repetition compulsion with the theory that it's attempting to master it and bring it to a higher turn, the spiral, which, in a variety of ways it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But then it has to go higher, and you're always revisiting it, but maybe in a more subtle way, right? You're always revisiting that. But now the larger picture is, when we look at reincarnation and we're peering into the psyche of the soul, are we looking at the total soul? And I don't believe we are, right? So I believe this, I look at the soul as a sphere, and I always use this example. For example, if you take a chart, right, and the soul is a sphere, then the chart is like a slice, a hologram of that sphere in 3D, right? But it's not the totality. It's a representation. So what you're coming and working on lifetime to lifetime is not necessarily the total experience of your soul, right? So, it's what can be worked on in this lifetime, or what you're imprinted with to bring forward, but it's not really the totality of your soul. And, I remember I asked Jeffrey that question a long time ago, Jeff Wolf Green, when I was studying with him. And he had said that, that we are devolving. And if you look at earlier civilizations, how they were permeated with what we would call a kind of spirituality that we don't have in our society today. It seems almost obvious, right?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, because that brings us to the non-linear nature of it. And, and of course, when I'm working with a client, I can see that we can move forward very quickly. And then suddenly there's not just a slump, but a slide back, which they experience as being very frustrating. But then at some point we, somehow we manage to turn that around, and then the healing progresses more solidly than before. And then there's another little slump, and perhaps a slide back, and that's the way it goes. But here we're talking about across centuries, and it could be that we have 1 or 2 centuries where we're devolving, and then something happens that makes us move forward again. And perhaps we need to take that view so as to not lose hope altogether.
Well, again, if we really look at Pluto as a symbol of that, there is a necessary movement to go to the underground. There's a necessary movement to constantly be going to pulling up roots, right? So there isn't an arrived at point. Do you know what I mean? It's a constant experiment. And there is a need to, like what we may call devolving or stuckness may be a pause that then needs to go deeper, right? It's like if you're drilling a tooth and you don't get to the, I'm using that analogy because I just had a root canal. If you're drilling a tooth and you don't get to the, to the toxin within the tooth, right? Or the bacteria within the tooth, you have to go in and drill again. And that is like the human psyche, and that is Pluto's operative mode. right? So collectively, we also need to play out. I mean, this is the thing in a human life, you know, because again, our individual choice is greater. Like you could put anybody in a group and they will act differently than they will as an individual, right? So we've already observed that quite frequently, you know, get swept up. So this is the same in the collective. So, you know, in an individual life, we have the opportunity to bring things through to completion quicker than we do collectively. And the collective, because we have such a diversity of collective perspective, we don't always have the opportunity to go to the root, right? So we have to slow down and go and pull up and go do some more digging collectively. I mean, the US is in its Pluto return, right? You know, the US is and has the US as a collective ever, and look at what's happening. I don't know how much you follow it, but in the US, you know, our collective history of colonialism and genocide and so on, and, you know, not even to mention the machinations of the CIA's involvement in totalitarian regimes and dictatorships and so on, and dirty politics in South America, you know, all of this stuff. Has that ever collectively really been looked at and dealt with? You know, and racism and no, you know.
Well, it's getting an airing at the moment.
It is, but then look at the backlash, right? Oh, you know, they give it a name, like racism, for example. We'll give it a name, critical race theory, which is not a really, anyway, that's a longer discussion. And then all of a sudden the banning begins. So now in Florida, they're banning books. We can't teach our children anything about race now. You know, it's that backlash, right?
Of course, because one extreme begets another.
Yeah.
So I guess the next question then that comes to my mind is, we're looking at the evolution of humanity as per where the discoveries end at Pluto. And we know, of course, that there have been quite a few more discoveries of late. So do you feel that new discoveries are going to perhaps help us to break this cycle?
You mean new discoveries in what? Other cosmic bodies? Other planets, asteroids, et cetera, et cetera. I feel that I feel that it's not, I feel it's coincident, right? I don't mean coincidence, but it's a coincidence. Just like the discovery of Pluto being a coincident or synchronistic with Freud and Jung's plumbing of depth psychology and bringing that to the collective. So I'm not saying the discovery of Pluto caused us to start to look at, it's a coincident thing that, you know, it was brewing in the collective's consciousness. And then those key figures that were the ones to bring it to, you know, more mass attention, but it had been going on before that, right? You know, Freud and Jung were the figureheads of that. So I think that, you know, it's important to pay attention to the collective. And I think that we often do this. We then assign that to outer bodies, right? We assign, you know, or the other way around. But I don't think that discovering things is going to change our consciousness. I mean, discovering other bodies.
I wondered whether it was pointing to a change in our consciousness.
I see.
That we are maybe discovering new aspects of ourselves. Could be maybe a bit more hopeful.
Yeah,
only because I'm just thinking about what new discoveries represent, new discovery, new mindsets, you know, the prospect of something different.
Well, the inclusion of the feminine asteroids and, you know, certain, I think, is an evolution. I think it's a representation of, but I don't think it goes far enough, to tell you the truth. I mean, I would like to reassign all the archetypes in astrology to absolutely represent the natural yin yang that's there, masculine, feminine polarity, you know, and it's all patriarchal. So,
well, I think we definitely have some interesting thoughts to look forward to coming up in your lecture at the Astrological Association, and you've certainly given everybody a lot to think about today. So Patricia, thank you very much for your
thank you, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the Astrological Association online. Lovely, I don't have to get on a plane.
Indeed. And so I will be putting a link to that in the description box, along with a link to your book, which I highly recommend to everyone. And if people want to find you, what's the best way to do that, Patricia?
My very outdated website, which actually none of my events have been updated pre-COVID, post-COVID, because I'm working on a new website. I keep threatening that I'm going to, you know, finish updating my website, but healthepast.com is my website.
I will be putting a link to that in the description box also. Thank you so much. Thank you all for watching. And next time we're going to be looking at astrology and personality theory. Until then, goodbye.